Let me begin with some general remarks on Japanese art culture. Having noted the foregoing specifications of the atmosphere emanating from Zen, we may now proceed to see what contributions Zen has made to the building up of Japanese culture. It is a significant fact that the other schools of Buddhism have limited their sphere of influence almost entirely to the spiritual life of the Japanese people. Zen has gone beyond it. Zen has entered internally into every phase of the cultural life of the people. In China, this was not necessarily the case. Zen united itself to a great extent with Taoist beliefs and practices and with the Confucian teaching of morality, but it did not affect the cultural life of the people so much as it did in Japan. I wonder, is it due to the racial psychology of the Japanese people that they have taken up Zen so intensely and deeply that it has entered intimately into their life? In China, however, I ought not omit to mention the noteworthy fact that Zen gave great impetus to the development of Chinese philosophy in the Sung dynasty, and also to the growth of a certain school of painting. A large number of examples of this school were brought over to Japan beginning with the Kamakura era in the 13th century, when Zen monks were constantly traveling between the two neighboring countries. The paintings of the southern Sung thus came to find their most ardent admirers on our side of the sea, and they are now national treasures of Japan, while in China no specimens of this class of painting are to be found. Before proceeding further, we may make a few general remarks about one of the peculiar features of Japanese art, which is closely related to and finally deducible from the world conception of Zen. Among things which strongly characterize Japanese artistic talents, we may mention the so-called one-corner style, which originated with Baien, one of the greatest southern Sung artists, who flourished from 1175 to 1225. The one-corner style is psychologically associated with the Japanese painter's so-called thrifty brush tradition of retaining the least possible number of lines or strokes which go to represent forms on silk or paper. Both are very much in accord with the spirit of Zen. A simple fishing boat in the midst of the rippling waters is enough to awaken in the mind of the beholder a sense of the vastness of the sea, and at the same time of peace and contentment. The Zen sense of the alone. Apparently the boat floats helplessly. It is a primitive structure with no mechanical device for stability and for audacious steering over the turbulent waves, and no scientific apparatus for braving all kinds of weather, quite a contrast to the modern ocean liner. But this very helplessness is the virtue of the fishing canoe, in contrast with which we feel the incomprehensibility of the absolute encompassing the boat and all the world. Again, a solitary bird on a dead branch, in which not a line, not a shade is wasted, is enough to show us the loneliness of autumn, when days become shorter and nature begins to roll up once more its gorgeous display of luxurious summer vegetation. It makes one feel somewhat pensive, but it gives one opportunity to withdraw the attention towards the inner life, which, given attention enough, spreads out its rich treasures ungrudgingly before the eyes. Here we have an appreciation of transcendental aloofness in the midst of multiplicities, which is known as wabi in the Dictionary of Japanese Cultural Terms. Wabi really means poverty, or negatively, not to be in the fashionable society of the time. To be poor, that is, not to be dependent on things worldly, wealth, power, and reputation, and yet to feel inwardly the presence of something of the highest value, above time and social position. This is what essentially constitutes wabi. Stated in terms of practical everyday life, wabi is to be satisfied with a little hut, a room of 2 or 3 tatami or mats, like the log cabin of Thoreau, and with a dish of vegetables picked in the neighboring fields, and perhaps to be listening to the pattering of a gentle spring rainfall. While later I will say something more about wabi, let me state here that the cult of wabi has entered deeply into the cultural life of the Japanese people. It is in truth the worshipping of poverty, probably a most appropriate cult in a poor country like ours. Despite the modern Western luxuries and comforts of life which have invaded us, there is still an ineradicable longing in us for the cult of wabi. Even in the intellectual life, not richness of ideas, Not brilliancy or solemnity in marshalling thoughts and building up a philosophical system is sought, but just to stay quietly content with the mystical contemplation of nature and to feel at home with the world is more inspiring to us, at least to some of us. However civilized, however much brought up in an artificially contrived environment, we all seem to have an innate longing for primitive simplicity, close to the natural state of living. Hence the city people's pleasure in summer camping in the woods, or traveling in the desert, or opening up an unbeaten track. We wish to go back once in a while to the bosom of nature and feel her pulsation directly. Zen's habit of mind to break through all forms of human artificiality and take firm hold of what lies behind them has helped the Japanese not to forget the soil, but to be always friendly with nature and appreciate her unaffected simplicity. Zen has no taste for complexities that lie on the surface of life. Life itself is simple enough, but when it is surveyed by the analyzing intellect, it presents unparalleled intricacies. With all the apparatus of science, we have not yet fathomed the mysteries of life. But once in its current, we seem to be able to understand it, with its apparently endless pluralities and entanglements. Very likely, the most characteristic thing in the temperament of the Eastern people is the ability to grasp life from within and not from without, and Zen has just struck it. In painting especially, disregard of form results when too much attention or emphasis is given to the all-importance of the spirit. The one-corner style and the economy of brushstrokes also help to effect aloofness from conventional rules. Where you would ordinarily expect a line or a mass or a balancing element, you miss it, and yet this very thing awakens in you an unexpected feeling of pleasure. In spite of shortcomings or deficiencies that no doubt are apparent, you do not feel them so. Indeed, this imperfection itself becomes a form of perfection. Evidently, beauty does not necessarily spell perfection of form. This has been one of the favorite tricks of Japanese artists, to embody beauty in a form of imperfection or even of ugliness. When this beauty of imperfection is accompanied by antiquity or primitive uncouthness, we have a glimpse of sabi, so prized by Japanese connoisseurs. Antiquity and primitiveness may not be in actuality. If an object of art suggests even superficially the feeling of a historical period, there is sabi in it. Sabi consists in rustic unpretentiousness or archaic imperfection, apparent simplicity or effortlessness in execution, and richness in historical associations, which, however, may not always be present. And lastly, it contains inexplicable elements that raise the object in question to the rank of an artistic production. These elements are generally regarded as derived from the appreciation of Zen. The utensils used in the tea room are mostly of this nature. The artistic element that goes into the constitution of sabi, which literally means loneliness or solitude, is poetically defined by a tea master like this. As I come out to this fishing village, late in the autumn day, no flowers in bloom I see, nor any tinted maple leaves. Aloneness indeed appeals to contemplation, and does not lend itself to spectacular demonstration. It may look most miserable, insignificant, and pitiable, especially when it is put up against the Western or modern setting. To be left alone, with no streamers flying, no fireworks crackling, and this amidst a gorgeous display of infinitely varied forms and endlessly changing colors, is indeed no sight at all. Take one of those sumie sketches, perhaps portraying Hanshan or Shite, hang it in a European or an American art gallery, and see what effect it will produce in the minds of the visitors. The idea of aloneness belongs to the East and is at home in the environment of its birth. It is not only to the fishing village on the autumnal eve that aloneness gives form, but also to a patch of green in the early spring, which is in all likelihood even more expressive of the idea of sabi or wabi. For in the green patch, as we hear in the following 31-syllable verse, there is an indication of life impulse amidst the wintry desolation. To those who only pray for the cherries to bloom, how I wish to show the spring that gleams from a patch of green in the midst of the snow-covered mountain village. This is given by one of the old tea masters as thoroughly expressive of sabi, which is one of the 4 principles governing the cult of tea, cha no yu. Here is just a feeble inception of life power as asserted in the form of a little green patch, but whoever has an eye can readily discern the spring shooting out from underneath the forbidding snow. It may be said to be a mere suggestion that stirs the mind, but just the same, it is life itself and not its feeble indication. To the artist, life is as much here as when the whole field is overlaid with verdure and flowers. One may call this the mystic sense of the artist. Asymmetry is another feature that distinguishes Japanese art. The idea is doubtlessly derived from the one-corner style of Baien. The plainest and boldest example is the plan of Buddhist architecture. The principal structures, such as the Tower Gate, the Dharma Hall, the Buddha Hall, and others, may be laid along one straight line. But structures of secondary or supplementary importance, sometimes even those of major importance, are not arranged symmetrically as wings along either side of that main line. They may be found irregularly scattered over the grounds in accordance with the topographical peculiarities. You will readily be convinced of this fact if you visit some of the Buddhist temples in the mountains. For example, the Ieyasu shrine at Nikko. We can say that asymmetry is quite characteristic of Japanese architecture of this class. This can be demonstrated very well in the construction of the tea room and in the tools used in connection with it. Look at the ceiling, which may be constructed in at least 3 different styles, and at some of the utensils for serving tea, and again at the grouping and laying of the stepping stones or flagstones in the garden. We find so many illustrations of asymmetry, or in a way of imperfection, or of the one-corner style. Some Japanese moralists try to explain this liking of the Japanese artists for things asymmetrically formed and counter to the conventional, or rather geometrical rules of art, by the theory that the people have been morally trained not to be obtrusive, but always to efface themselves, and that this mental habit of self-annihilation manifests itself accordingly in art. For example, when the artist leaves the important central space unoccupied. But to my mind, this theory is not quite correct. Would it not be a more plausible explanation to say that the artistic genius of the Japanese people has been inspired by the Zen way of looking at individual things as perfect in themselves, and at the same time as embodying the nature of totality which belongs to the One? The doctrine of ascetic aestheticism is not so fundamental as that of Zen aestheticism. Art impulses are more primitive or more innate than those of morality. The appeal of art goes more directly into human nature. Morality is regulative, art is creative. One is an imposition from without, the other is an irrepressible expression from within. Zen finds its inevitable association with art, but not with morality. Zen may remain unmoral, but not without art. When the Japanese artists create objects imperfect from the point of view of form, they may even be willing to ascribe their art motive to the current notion of moral asceticism. But we need not give too much significance to their own interpretation or to that of the critics. Our consciousness is not, after all, a very reliable standard of judgment. However this may be, asymmetry is certainly characteristic of Japanese art, which is one of the reasons informality or approachability also marks to a certain degree Japanese objects of art. Symmetry inspires a notion of grace, solemnity, and impressiveness, which is again the case with logical formalism or the piling up of abstract ideas. The Japanese are often thought not to be intellectual and philosophical because their general culture is not thoroughly impregnated with intellectuality. This criticism, I think, results somewhat from the Japanese love of asymmetry. The intellectual primarily aspires to balance, while the Japanese are apt to ignore it and incline strongly towards imbalance. Imbalance, asymmetry, the one corner, poverty, sabi or wabi, simplification, aloneness, and cognate ideas make up the most conspicuous and characteristic features of Japanese art and culture. All these emanate from one central perception of the truth of Zen, which is the one in the many and the many in the one, or better, the one remaining as one in the many individually and collectively. That Zen has helped to stimulate the artistic impulses of the Japanese people and to color their works with ideas characteristic of Zen is due to the following facts. The Zen monasteries were almost exclusively the repositories of learning and art, at least during the Kamakura and Muromachi eras. The Zen monks had constant opportunities to come in contact with foreign cultures. The monks themselves were artists, scholars, and mystics. They were even encouraged by the political powers of the time to engage in commercial enterprises to bring foreign objects of art and industry to Japan. Finally, the aristocrats and the politically influential classes of Japan were patrons of Zen institutions and were willing to submit themselves to the discipline of Zen. Zen thus worked not only directly on the religious life of the Japanese, but also most strongly on their general culture. The principal schools of Buddhism in Japan, other than Zen, are the Tendai, the Shingon, the Jodo, the Shin, and the Nichiren. The Tendai, the Shingon, and the Jodo contributed greatly to imbue the Japanese with the spirit of Buddhism, and through their iconography to develop their artistic instincts for sculpture, color painting, architecture, textile fabrics, and metalwork. But the philosophy of Tendai is too abstract and abstruse to be understood by the masses. The ritualism of Shingon is too elaborate and complicated, and consequently too expensive for popularity. On the other hand, Shingon and Tendai and Jodo produced fine sculptures and pictures and artistic utensils to be used in their daily worship. The most highly prized national treasures belong to the Tempyo, the Nara, and the Heian periods, when those two schools of Buddhism were in the ascendancy and intimately involved with the cultured classes of the people. The Jodo teaches the Pure Land in all its magnificence, where the Buddha of infinite light is attended by his retinue of bodhisattvas, and this inspired the artists to paint those splendid pictures of Amida preserved in the various Buddhist temples of Japan. The Nichiren and the Shin are the creation of the Japanese religious mind. The Nichiren gave no specifically artistic and cultural impetus to us. The Shin tended to be somewhat iconoclastic and produced nothing worth mentioning in the arts and literature except the hymns known as the Wasan and the honorable letters, Gobunsho or Ofumi, chiefly written in the 15th century by Rennyo. Zen came to Japan after Shingon and Tendai, and was at once embraced by the military classes. It was more or less by an historical accident that Zen was set against the aristocratic priesthood. The nobility, too, in the beginning felt a certain dislike for it, and made use of their political advantage to stir up opposition to Zen. In the beginning of the Japanese history of Zen, therefore, Zen avoided Kyoto and established itself under the patronage of the Hojo family in Kamakura. This place, as the seat of the feudal government in those days, became the headquarters of Zen discipline. Many Zen monks from China settled in Kamakura and found strong support in the Hojo family, Tokiyori, Tokimuni, and their successors and retainers. The Chinese masters brought many artists and objects of art along with them, and the Japanese who came back from China were also bearers of art and literature. In the 12th and 13th centuries, pictures of Kake, Mokkei, Ryokai, Baien, and others thus found their way to Japan. Manuscripts of the noted Zen masters of China were also given shelter in the monasteries here. Calligraphy in the Far East is an art just as much as sumie painting, and it was cultivated almost universally among the intellectual classes in olden times. The spirit pervading Zen pictures and calligraphy made a strong impression on them, and Zen was readily taken up and followed. In it there is something virile and unbending, a mild, gentle, and graceful air, almost feminine one might call it, which prevailed in the periods preceding the Kamakura, is now superseded by an air of masculinity, expressing itself mostly in the sculpture and calligraphy of the period. The rugged virility of the warriors of the Kwanto districts is proverbial, in contrast to the grace and refinement of the courtiers in Kyoto. The soldierly quality, with its mysticism and aloofness from worldly affairs, appeals to the willpower. Zen, in this respect, walks hand in hand with the spirit of Bushido, the warrior's way. Another factor in the discipline of Zen, or rather in the monastic life in which Zen carries out its scheme of teaching, is this. As the monastery is usually situated in the mountains, its inmates are in the most intimate touch with nature. They are close and sympathetic students of it. They observe plants, birds, animals, rocks, rivers, which people of the town would leave unnoticed. And their observation deeply reflects their philosophy, or better, their intuition. It is not that of a mere naturalist. It penetrates into the life itself of the objects that come under the monk's observation. Whatever they may paint of nature will inevitably be expressive of this intuition. The spirit of the mountains will be felt softly breathing in their works. The fundamental intuition the Zen masters gain through their discipline seems to stir up their artistic instincts, if they are at all susceptible to art. The intuition that impels the masters to create beautiful things, that is, to express the sense of perfection through things ugly and imperfect, is apparently closely related to the feeling for art. The Zen masters may not make good philosophers, but they are very frequently fine artists. Even their technique is often of the first order, and besides, they know how to tell us something unique and original. One such is Musou, the national teacher, who lived from 1275 to 1351. He was a fine calligrapher and a great landscape gardener. Wherever he resided, at quite a number of places in Japan, he designed splendid gardens, some of which are still in existence and well preserved after so many years of changing times. Among the noted painters of Zen in the 14th and 15th centuries, we may mention Cho Densu, Kei Shoki, Josetsu, Shubun, Seshu, and others. Georges Dutuy, the author of Chinese Mysticism and Modern Painting, seems to understand the spirit of Zen mysticism. From him we have this. When the Chinese artist paints, what matters is the concentration of thought and the prompt and vigorous response of the hand to the directing will. Tradition ordains him to see, or rather to feel, as a whole the work to be executed, before embarking on anything. As it is said, if the ideas of a man are confused, he will become the slave of exterior conditions. He who deliberates and moves his brush intent on making a picture misses to a still greater extent the art of painting. Draw bamboos for 10 years, become a bamboo, then forget all about bamboos when you are drawing. In possession of an infallible technique, the individual places himself at the mercy of inspiration. Unquote. To become a bamboo and to forget that you are one with it while drawing it, this is the Zen of the bamboo. This is the moving with the rhythmic movement of the spirit which resides in the bamboo as well as in the artist himself. What is now required of him is to have a firm hold on the spirit and yet not to be conscious of the fact. This is a very difficult task achieved only after long spiritual training. The Eastern people have been taught since the earliest times to subject themselves to this kind of discipline if they want to achieve something in the world of art and religion. Zen, in fact, has given expression to it in the following phrase, one in all and all in one. When this is thoroughly understood, there is creative genius. It is of utmost importance here to interpret the phrase in its proper sense. People imagine that it means pantheism, and some students of Zen seem to agree. This is to be regretted, for pantheism is something foreign to Zen, and also to the artist's understanding of his work. When the Zen masters declare the one to be in the all and the all in the one, they do not mean that there is a thing to be known as the one, or as the all, and that the one is the other, and vice versa. As the one is in the all, some people suppose that Zen is a pantheistic teaching. Far from it. Zen would never hypostasize the one or the all as a thing to be grasped by the senses. The phrase one in all and all in one is to be understood as an expression of absolute prajna, intuition, and is not to be conceptually analyzed. When we see the moon, we know that it is the moon, and that is enough. Those who proceed to analyze the experience and try to establish a theory of knowledge are not students of Zen. They cease to be so, if they ever were, at the very moment of their procedure as analysts. Zen always upholds its experience as such, and refuses to commit itself to any system of philosophy. Even when Zen indulges in intellection, it never subscribes to a pantheistic interpretation of the world. For one thing, there is no one in Zen. If Zen ever speaks of the one, as if it recognized it, this is a kind of condescension to common parlance. To Zen students, the one is the all, and the all is the one. And yet the one remains the one, and the all the all. Not two may lead the logician to think it is one, but the master would go on saying, not one either. What then, we may ask? We here face a blind alley as far as verbalism is concerned. Therefore, it is said that, if you wish to be in direct communion with reality, I tell you, not two. The following mondo, a form of question and answer, may help to illustrate the point I wish to make in regard to the Zen attitude towards the so-called pantheistic interpretation of nature. A monk asked Tosu, a Zen master of the Tang period, I understand that all sounds are the voice of the Buddha. Is this right? The master said, that is right. The monk then proceeded, would not the master please stop making a noise which echoes the sound of a fermenting mass of filth? The master thereupon struck the monk. The monk further asked Tosu, am I in the right when I understand the Buddha as asserting that all talk, however trivial or derogatory, belongs to ultimate truth? The master said, yes, you are in the right. The monk went on, may I then call you a donkey? The master thereupon struck him. It may be necessary to explain these mondo in plain language. To conceive every sound, every noise, every utterance one makes as issuing from the fountainhead of one reality, that is, from one God, is pantheistic, I imagine. For as it is written in Acts 17:25, He giveth to all life and breath and all things. And again from Acts 17:28, For in Him we live and move and have our being. If this be the case, a Zen master's hoarse throat echoes the melodious resonance of the voice flowing from the Buddha's golden mouth, and even when a great teacher is decried as reminding one of an ass, the defamation must be regarded as reflecting something of ultimate truth. All forms of evil must be said somehow to be embodying what is true and good and beautiful, and to be a contribution to the perfection of reality. To state it more concretely, bad is good, ugly is beautiful, false is true, imperfect is perfect, and also conversely. This is indeed the kind of reasoning in which those indulge who conceive the God nature to be immanent in all things. Let us see how the Zen master treats this problem. It is remarkable that Tosu put his foot right down against such intellectualist interpretations and struck his monk. The latter, in all probability, expected to see the master nonplussed by his statements, which logically follow from his first assertion. The masterful Tosu knew, as all Zen masters do, the uselessness of making any verbal demonstration against such a logician, for verbalism leads from one complication to another. There is no end to it. The only effective way, perhaps, to make such a monk as this one realize the falsehood of his conceptual understanding is to strike him, and so let him experience within himself the meaning of the statement, one in all and all in one. The monk was to be awakened from his logical somnambulism, hence Tosu's drastic measure. Sekcho, one of the great Zen masters of the Sung, noted for his literary accomplishments, here gives his comments in the following lines. Pity that people without number try to play with the tide. They are all ultimately swallowed up into it and die. Let them suddenly awake from the deadlock and see that all the rivers run backwards, swelling and surging. What is needed here is an abrupt turning or awakening, with which one comes to the realization of the truth of Zen, which is neither transcendentalism, nor immanentism, nor a combination of the two. The truth is, as Tosu declares in the following, a monk asks, "What is the Buddha?" Tosu answers, "The Buddha." Monk, "What is the Tao?" Tosu, "The Tao." Monk, "What is Zen?" Tosu, "Zen." The master answers like a parrot. He is echo itself. In fact, there is no other way of illumining the monk's mind than affirming that what is, which is the final fact of experience.